Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show.
Hello everybody, welcome, and yes, we're back again. I know I wasn't here last Thursday, but we're here again, and we should be back to normal programming for a while at least. So tonight we're going to be discussing fictional truth and non-fictional falsehood, and by that I mean we're going to be discussing what does it actually mean to say something that is fictional, and is something fictional necessarily a falsehood, or are there truths within fiction? What does it mean to say that a truth can be found in fiction? What kind of truths would they even be? So that is the idea of tonight's stream. We're going to be going into that sort of thing in far more detail and discussing these concepts. And just basically when we hear people say things like, yeah, you're clearly lying, are they lying, or are they just telling a falsehood? You know, have they believed a fiction? Was there any truth to it? There's all these sorts of concepts that sort of weave their web, and we're going to hopefully unravel them a little bit for you. Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Billy Butcher.
You can't.
You can't.
I've been enjoying that, actually, now that it's back.
It's a great start to the new season, isn't it?
It definitely is.
Yeah.
I really wasn't expecting the Ant-Man bit.
No, that was amazing. Yeah.
Though as soon as it started, so much detail. And as soon as it started, I went, I know where it's going now. But I was just never expecting they would do that. Of course, we can't tell you because that'd be spoilers. And, we don't want to spoil it for you. But if you haven't been watching The Boys, go watch it.
Yeah, go watch it.
In fact, turn off this stream right now. Season 3's out. Go watch it. You can catch us on the rerun.
I mean, they could catch The Boys on the rerun as well, but
but
you're better off just watching The Boys twice than watching us once.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. But tonight we are discussing something that sort of ties into The Boys. We're discussing, fiction and falsehoods and all that sort of thing. So, in fact, the way you put it, Dave, for the title, wasn't it? It was fictional
truth, non-fictional falsehood.
That's it, yeah. Yeah, I already forgot the title of the stream. We've only just started. That's a good sign, isn't it?
I only know it because I've got it on the screen at the moment.
Fair. Yeah. So, hello, Smackdab. So let's bring that up. Right. This is an interesting comment that I'm sure will tie into what we're going to be saying later on. It says, fiction can influence behavior and become reality, like tractor beams, hoverboards, or the founding of Israel. And it's I know the hoverboard isn't exactly there, but it has influenced people to try and make these sorts of things and advanced technology. And it's one of the things I actually like about sci-fi myself, is the fact that quite often it's science possibility. It's not necessarily there yet. And I think the good sci-fi is science possibility. And I can enjoy some of the other sci-fi that's just, no, that's never going to happen. But the stuff that I can go, oh yeah, if we had this technology and it could do this, and that's the bit that really, really grips me. So Dave, do you want to take away, and tell us a bit more about tonight's topic?
Well, I thought it might be interesting. I was kind of inspired by a discussion going on between Steen and Tarquin.
Oh, yes.
And it was discussing, part of the conversation was about relative truths, how truth is relative and all that. But we both know I think that's nonsense. So But he was also discussing how there's like truths of being human in the Bible and in the Quran, and we can find them in fiction, and truths about the human experience, truths about certain outlooks on the world. And a lot of people tend to use the term truth in fiction. And if you think about what a lot of atheists say, they'll say, well, the Bible is just fiction. So what does it mean for something to be just fiction? Like, that's another thing. We should probably discuss what fiction is first and what non-fiction is, or like how we might see it. Because by saying the Bible is just fiction, there's a sort of implication in that, isn't there? That, well, it's all false.
Yes, there is. I mean, especially with the way it's said, which isn't really necessarily the case. I mean, if we'll discuss fiction in a second, but even with the Bible, there's certain things that you could say are true from a historical perspective. There are definitely things that aren't as well. But you could say there are things that are true from a moral perspective, unless you're a complete non-cognitivist, and then you wouldn't.
Yeah. But there's stuff like be good to your neighbors, giving to charity is good.
And even as a non-cognitivist, you could still say that there is a truth that doing this benefits society. There are certain truths.
It benefits you by benefit. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They might not be propositional, but there is a certain amount of truth to what comes out of it.
Yeah. And even though, I mean, as you and I would both conclude from all the religious texts there, that they are largely false. They're not completely untrue. There is something in the spirit there, and there are certain historical accuracies in there. There are certain truths within. So when someone says something like fiction, if we're thinking about a story, what exactly do we mean by fiction?
Exactly. It's kind of a difficult one to answer, because if you say, well, a fiction is just something that's all made up, well, then Sherlock Holmes isn't particularly fiction. It's got elements of fiction in it, but it's not fiction, because if fiction is completely made up, Sherlock Holmes isn't completely made up.
No. But then you turn around and go, well, the characters are, the stories are, it's just based on true things.
Yeah. So could we then say something like fiction is an attempt to tell a story? It's putting across something that's not necessarily meant to give us information about the world, but to tell us a story, or it can teach us a lesson through the story, and it might be the purpose to tell a moral lesson, like in Aesop's fables.
Mm-hmm.
But it has a different intent to nonfiction. Nonfiction intends to impart information onto the reader or the viewer or what have you, and it intends to impart accurate information. Whereas the purpose of fiction isn't to impart information in that way. It's to entertain, maybe teach us a moral lesson, and maybe put us on an emotional roller coaster, but the intent isn't to tell us something factual.
So what in the instance of, just say that there was a story, let's say there's a story which is completely true, they told the story exactly as it happened, but all the names were changed. Would that count as fiction or non-fiction? Because it by what you're saying about telling us, teaching us information, it's not the same as picking up a non-fiction book about ancient Greece or something like that. It's still telling us a story, but it's telling us what actually happened minus a couple of details.
I would say it would still be non-fiction, because it's intending to give you the real story, but maybe protect the people involved in the story. And it's usually said at the beginning, this is a true story, but the names have been changed to protect the people involved. So it is imparting actual information onto you. So it wouldn't be fiction, because you know that these are real people, and it's discussing real people and discussing real world events, real life events, but it's not telling you all the details for reason X or reason Y.
in comparison with something like, as you said earlier on, Sherlock Holmes, that it's a made-up character, made-up stories. Yes, the places are real. Yes, the procedures might be real. Yes, his conclusions could be completely accurate, but the way he gets to them is potentially a little bit unrealistic. But it's all about telling you a story and entertaining you, rather than going, yeah, this is the thing that happened.
Yeah, exactly. It has a different purpose. Ben just brought up an interesting one, and it was one I was going to mention: Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Yes.
It's based on a real person. Lots of the events in it kind of happened, but just not the way they were told. So to some degree, this is the opposite of what you just mentioned, where it's telling a true story but changing the names.
Yeah.
This is telling a story based on real names, but, something that didn't
completely fictional
happen. Yeah. It's being told for the purpose of entertainment. Sure, there's some truth in it. And in that sense, it's truth, as in this is an accurate representation rather than some kind of metaphorical truth.
So, Kimmo actually brings up something that is kind of interesting and says etymologically, and obviously we've discussed, etymology isn't necessarily the same as use or the same as the way something is defined today, but fiction comes from the Latin word fictionem, to lie or to feign, which is interesting in itself, because you can understand why people would get that from fiction. It's a book of lies. But it's not necessarily how it's being applied today. Yes, there is a certain lie to it, but it doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. And in fact, wouldn't we say the best lies contain enough truth to go undetected anyway?
Exactly. And also, would you actually call fiction, as as in a fictional book or a fictional show, a lie? Because a lie is told with an intent to deceive, whereas fiction, they let you know already that nothing in it is true, apart from maybe some people's names, some places, maybe a couple of events. But they're not trying to tell you a truth. They're not trying to deceive you into thinking that any of it is true.
No, you're right. There, as you mentioned, it's the intent to deceive. I mean, some people do argue that intent doesn't have to be there, but I'd have that intent there. You're trying to make someone believe this thing, and not only that, with the intent to deceive, you have to know it's false as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, somebody could tell you a story about their friend seeing Bigfoot when they were camping, and that is essentially a fiction because, let's face it, Bigfoot isn't real. But if the person that thought they saw Bigfoot and told that person thinking they saw Bigfoot, and that person believed them and then told you, they weren't deceiving you, they weren't lying. As far as they're concerned, they were telling you a non-fiction.
Yeah, they were, but it was a falsehood rather than
a lie. Yeah.
And there's that separation there, and so I think you can conclude maybe that the Bible, for example, is full of falsehoods. That doesn't mean that there's no truths in there still, but it's also not necessarily a work of fiction.
Exactly, because if the writers of the Bible told it with the intent as if they were telling you some historical facts, and let's face it, history was slightly different back then. It wasn't just about imparting actual events, it was about telling a good story at the same time, because
that was their entertainment.
Yeah, not just that. In a place where there's no written word, no papers, no books, you have to pass that information on, and one of the easiest ways to remember something is to be enthralled by a story.
Mm-hmm.
Facts, figures, all that stuff kind of gets lost. Whereas if you're gripped to a story, you remember it better, and you're more likely to pass it on to the next generation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So maybe, right? Let's put the most uncharitable light on it here. Even assuming that some of the original authors were actually lying, let's say they were doing it for fame or money or whatever, would that suddenly make it a work of fiction, considering how it's presented now through time?
That's an interesting question. Like Dave has just said in the chat, you can't genreify books from antiquity in modern terms. And that's kind of true, because in the past, there was no fiction, no non-fiction. There was just
The
stories
story.
yeah. And I think to some degree, it's kind of like art, where part of the intent going into it is to create a work of art, or not necessarily a work of art in, like the kind of sense that we would think of art. But like Stephen King obviously thinks he's writing at least some kind of art. He's writing horror literature, and literature can be considered art. Whereas in the past, they wouldn't have been. So I think without somebody going in with that intent of writing fiction, I'm not sure it can be considered fiction. So even though we might class them as fiction now, because they embellished and they had the intent to embellish, but embellishing might not necessarily be the same as writing fiction.
That's sort of is exaggeration a lie?
Yeah.
Because the reason you're exaggerating can have different purposes, obviously, but a lot of the time it's just to get people to accept what you're saying,
and make them listen.
Yeah. And it's the truth within what you're saying that matters. But you could say that there is that intent to deceive, in the sense that you're making them listen because you're making it out to be a more interesting thing than it is, and you're deceiving them on that front. You're making them think it's more interesting or a better story than it actually is. So yeah. I suppose it's the intent you're doing it, though, because if you're just doing it, if you're a natural storyteller, you might just come out, you might just make things more interesting and add certain bits to it. You think about when people sometimes rewrite scripts or stories or anything like that, even if it's a true story, they might change certain things just because this scene to this scene works better if we throw this in there and it makes more sense, whereas the truth was, it was something that didn't make sense, but to the audience, if that was so disjointed.
Yeah, exactly. So I think fiction, it's kind of a difficult concept to put your finger on. It's not an easy thing. Like, a lot of people will say, well, the Bible is full of falsehoods, therefore it's a fiction. Now think of phrenology, the study of the bumps on the head. People taught that knowledge, or what they thought was knowledge, and taught it as if it was true. Thinking it was true, and imparted it in a sense of passing on knowledge. So in the same sense as passing on a book about evolution.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all false. So would it be considered fiction?
No, because of the intent, I guess.
That's why I'm saying intent matters, because of what they're trying to do. So in the case of fiction, there's an intent to tell a story. There's an intent to entertain. Whereas I'm not sure the Bible was written specifically for that. It was written in some sort of non-fictional sense, at least some of it, like the genealogies, the telling of certain events that happened, certain kings. It might have been mythologized, but their intent was to tell some piece of history. And if you think about how long it had been passed down, and you think of the telephone game, it might have started telling an accurate story, but as each generation went on, they added a little bit more to it until it became mythologized. But they were still intending to pass on a true story.
Yeah, I mean that is always a good example to bring up, you know, especially when things are passed down by oral tradition. And then you've got things, you know, like memory can change things as well. Oh, I can't remember this bit of the story. I'll just add this bit in, you know. And Kimo says, certainly dialectic narratives, especially religious ones, are understood as stories that let the facts of the tale assemble in ways that are convenient or necessary to emphasize the moral lesson. I mean, I suppose something along there, you could talk about even Aesop's fables. It's, you know, the boy that cried wolf. I'm very sure that never actually happened.
But it could be discussing a scenario that did, you know, in your sense that, you know, somebody's telling a true story but changed the names.
Yeah.
It might have begun like that.
But it might not have been a wolf. It could have been a kid that was out and was constantly asking for help. And you know, then one day he got mugged and stabbed or something like that. And no one came to his aid because he was always teasing people, or, you know, or maybe it is based on a story and about the wolves. Who knows? Wolf also says, there was a time when if you didn't support the social lie, your neck would be on the line. Kings and emperors had major investments in enforcing social lies for the greater good. It's a bit of an interesting take as well.
Yeah, the benign lie sort of thing. Plato discusses it that if we have a society, there are certain lies that are good to tell by those in charge. If you think about something like religion, it's even if the people passing it on know it's like a noble truth, it helps to have a cohesive society. And if you think about back then, if you had people believing that there was going to be a judgment for them, no police force, no jails, so they have this way of maintaining some kind of social order and getting people to behave even when they're not being watched. So it's kind of considered a noble lie. Also, I just want to grab some vape liquid. I won't be a sec.
And SmackDab says, seeing a connection to placebos as well. Placebos are an interesting one. I've often heard that there's one of our authors that really hates the idea of placebo, and they say that it just doesn't work no matter what you say. But there's a reason why people go through all these different tests, and you have the placebo groups. So you do have the useful lie within testing, and you have the placebo groups. Yeah, you're getting the medicine. You're getting the medicine. And you actually see if there is a significant difference between the groups. So from that effect, definitely, I definitely think that is a really good example of, like you mentioned, Dave, the noble lie. Completely different reason for it, you know. And it might even be interesting to tell people that they are on the placebo when they're on the medicine and see if that had any difference.
Just to see if that has an effect, yeah. And I mean, if you think about it, most people going into those kind of tests and studies, they know that there's a control group that gets a placebo. So they don't know that they're on it, but they are entering into this kind of contract where they know that at least some of that group is going to be getting a placebo, and it might be them. So they're not being deceived. They're just not being told the entire truth.
Yeah, that's fair. Ben says there are types of fiction with different intents, some to mislead, some to entertain, some to impart truth through accessible messaging. Yes, I definitely agree on the entertaining and the imparting truth. Would we say that it's fiction if the design is to mislead, or would we actually say that it's an outright lie sort of thing?
If it's written to intentionally deceive, then it's probably
lie.
being sold as nonfiction, because the intent is to make you think it's the truth, but they're deceiving you.
Yeah, that's fair.
There's kind of a social contract when you read fiction, isn't there?
Yeah, that you know that it's
between
not
you
true.
and the author. Yeah.
Or at least most of it's not true. There might be bits that are true. I mean, yes, you can watch Harry Potter or read Harry Potter, and we have trains in England, and
doesn't it mention a couple of real railway stations and a couple of real towns? Yeah,
exactly. So even though there are those true things within it, Ben says, right, but it's fiction because of the perspective of the author of right, but is it fiction because of the perspective of the author or because of the perspective of the recipient? So if you were to find it in a bookstore, if something is in the fiction section, it's fiction sort of thing. I know this is a bit of a tautology, but if you think about you're going in to buy a book, if something is in the non-fiction section, but it's actually a lie, I'm not saying it's non-fiction, but it's not fiction either, because the purpose of fiction isn't to be sold as truth and deceive you in some way. You know it's fiction. But I suppose you could say that from the perspective of the author, they know it's not true. It could be fiction, but again, there's the intent there. They're just outright lying. When it's fiction, they're not lying. You know that it's not true.
Yeah, in the case of meaning to deceive, they're attempting to make you think that something actually happened. So they're presenting it as nonfiction. Like, they might know it's all false, but they're trying to tell this narrative. Like, fiction has a narrative through it. So in that sense, nonfiction could have a narrative if they're presenting something fake. Like, imagine a Trumper writing a book about how great Trump's presidency was. He would probably believe a lot of that. And his purpose would be to make you think that this is what it was like. But he would be doing it with the intent of being a bit deceitful.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting split, isn't it? It's these seem like things that should be really easy to break down, and you can see why everyone has a very single-minded view on these things. There's no difference between a fiction and a lie. Because, especially with the way language works, that's sort of how they're colloquially used. But from what we've discussed so far, there is that intended difference. That fiction is falsehoods. You know a falsehood. There's no intent to deceive. I think that's the main takeaway from it. You are aware with fiction that you are reading fiction.
Crisis just brought up an interesting point.
Oh, hey, Crisis, and Jovial Dane. Nice to see you pop in there.
I don't like when folks fake nonfiction. It's just not right. Just call it fiction, whatever propaganda it is. Now, there's an example of this idea of trying to be deceitful, depending on how you take propaganda to be. Propaganda about, think of Kim Jong-il, who was the one before.
Il before Un, wasn't it?
Yeah. Think about the stories that are told about him. The propaganda. He came down from a rainbow. He was born in a cave. There was a thunderclap in heaven. Now, the people that created those knew they were fake, but they were passing it on as if it was true. it's propaganda, but it's not necessarily fiction. So you could say that there is a slight difference between propaganda meant to deceive and fiction.
Yeah. Again, it's the lies, because there's that intent to deceive, and the fiction, which is false. So if he was saying, just call it fiction, whatever propaganda it is, well, if you tell someone it's fiction, they know it's false, so they're not going to believe it. The idea is you want someone to believe the propaganda, so it has to be sold as truth. So I agree with you. I don't like it when folks fake non-fiction. I don't either. I don't really like people lying about stuff.
It's dishonest. Yeah, it's a lie.
But the whole separation of the two is purely that thing. It's, if they don't fake non-fiction, you'll know it is fiction, and therefore you won't believe it. The only way you could do it is create some other propaganda that says they're classing this as fiction even though it shouldn't be, but then you're moving that step back and making some non-fiction to qualify that fiction should also be non-fiction. And
yeah. And I mean, another one, if you think about the original, the tale of the original Thanksgiving, we all know now that that's not how it happened. But that story wasn't passed on. It was passed on with the intent, not directly to deceive, even though that they knew they would be deceiving people, but it was about myth-making and culture building and nation creating. So it was being passed on as if this was the real event that happened. This is one of the reasons why we should be questioning these grand narratives, obviously. But that, again, propaganda rather than fiction. Non-fiction, it's fiction being presented as non-fiction, but for a very specific purpose.
Yeah. And it makes sense not to even regard it in the light of sort of fiction, non-fiction. You just call it a lie or propaganda.
Yeah, rather than fiction, because, like we said already, fiction involves a kind of social contract that you enter into it, and you're going to suspend your disbelief, sort of. You're going to accept the story as it comes. You're going to know that they're not trying to deceive you, but they're not telling you the truth. Or they might be passing on some metaphorical truths. And none of that is in propaganda.
Awesome. Hopefully that answers your point there, Crisis. Dave, Lone Wolf says, well, remember Jules Verne first published From the Earth to the Moon as a parody adventure story that was alleged to be real, unless the reader read closely. I mean, I don't remember that, but have you read it, Dave?
I've read 10,000 Leagues, but I've not read that.
Fair.
Here's another one. Orson Welles and his War of the Worlds broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a whole myth built up around it that we now know isn't true. But he told that story as if it was true, as if it was a non-fiction. But it was a fiction. It was from a book. So that's a kind of interesting case there. If you thought about it and read between the lines, you would know it was a fiction. But that's a particular narrative style.
Yeah.
Fictional narrative style. What's Truman Capote in Cold Blood?
I don't know.
Have you ever read that? No. And I can't remember who wrote this, but there's a book about Fred and Rosemary West called Happy Little Murderers.
I haven't read that either, no.
They're telling the true story in a fictional narrative. Or using the sort of tropes of fiction to tell a more interesting and more enthralling story. It's not just the facts, it's painting the picture. So it's a type of non-fiction narrative told through the tropes of fiction.
So it's not just a non-fiction that has had the names changed, so a couple of bits have been fictionalized to protect people. It's actually changed large parts of it.
It's filled in gaps where they couldn't have the information. And they've taken the bodies, seen the damage, heard the police reports. But then to humanize the story, they've told, rather than just give you the facts, they've told a little story about how it might have happened and how it might have felt and what might have been going on. So they were filling in details that they might not necessarily have. But they're not intending to deceive you that this is how it actually happened. It's just that we don't have the information. We're trying to tell you a story. We're trying to humanize these people, but we're talking about the facts as well. It's nonfiction told through a narrative like fiction.
Sort of blurring the lines a little bit.
Yeah, and Truman Capote did that as well.
Apparently, Crisis says the original creators of Leatherface had a whole monologue on it being real events scaring people for a while as well. I didn't know that.
It's right at the very beginning of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Sorry, your
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It was really weird. You started talking and nothing was coming through, and then it stopped.
Sorry about that. Hang on.
You sound
I'm wondering
fine
if the cable's loose. Yeah, but I've got my hand on the cable sometimes, so I'm wondering if maybe it was a bit loose. Yeah, at the beginning it says this is based on a real story. The people being talked about are real, etc., etc. But you also know that it's not going into it. Because that's just part of that narrative. It's part of using the scariness of nonfiction, and like when you hear about a real life serial killer, that's slightly more scary than hearing about Hannibal Lecter. So they use that to create a part of the fiction and a part of the mood of the fiction.
Yeah. Sorry, just trying to get through the comments. Apparently, according to Wolf, Byrne was frustrated with the practice of adventure diaries to embellish the adventure to sell more copies. So when you say that adventure diaries, as in, people were writing sort of journal notes within particular adventures, is that what you're saying there, Wolf? I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about there. And Ben says, right, Dave, this is the kind of example I was imagining. I was thinking about Orwell and the party's narrative in 1984.
That was when I was talking about Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-il, yeah.
So Lone Wolf also says, so in a way, the lies of the adventure diaries frustrated Jules Verne so much that he wrote a novel so fantastic that it inspired humanity to actually go to the moon. Is that a useful fiction? Was it a noble lie?
Well, I mean, that's another interesting form of fiction, is the useful fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, the kind of story we tell to make the world an easier place to navigate, like
justice.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett mentions about justice.
Yeah, or you could say, moral fictionalism, which is a valid take on it. I don't think it's necessarily right, but if it is, it's similar to the way to justice, the useful fiction, and there are just certain things that make things better, and there's truth in that fiction, isn't it? Because it's true that it makes the world a better place. So
yeah,
this fake thing.
Yeah, just because you label something as fiction doesn't necessarily mean it's all false.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm always amused when people say the Bible's fiction. It's like, well, what do you mean by fiction? You can never have that actual conversation because you just get blocked and shouted at.
Yeah.
Or shouted at and blocked. But, when you say the Bible is just fiction, well, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah. And it might be full of falsehoods. It is. But
But if its intent is to pass on actual history, just like the Book of Phrenology, it might be full of falsehoods, but they're non-fictional falsehoods.
Yeah.
It doesn't become fiction just because it's not right.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. It does sort of boggle your mind a bit though when you go, a false non-fiction and a true fiction.
A true fiction, yeah.
Because your mind does go, that doesn't make sense. They sound like logical contradictions. And if you're thinking about them in really like binary
Black
terms,
and white. Yeah.
they are contradictions. But if you actually understand the concepts to a little bit greater detail, something that is true and false, obviously that is binary. But when you're talking about fiction and non-fiction, there's a bit more to it than it being true or false. But I think when most people do use terms like fiction and non-fiction, when people say fiction, they mean it's false or a lie. And when people say non-fiction, they think it's true, or someone telling the truth. And people often don't even take into account the difference between a lie and a falsehood. And when you try and have that conversation online, that doesn't necessarily go well either. People say things, well, these people don't know that they're lying. If they don't know that they're lying, they're not lying.
They can't be lying, yeah.
And those conversations don't necessarily go well.
Well, that's one of the things I like about the book Happy Little Murderers and like the Truman Capote take in Cold Blood. Now, if fiction is telling a story that isn't true, then these two books don't fall into fiction because they're telling a story that is true.
Mm.
But they're not just giving facts, and they might have embellished a few bits and filled in gaps. So they're also not just giving you facts. So which one does that fit into?
Yeah, again, I mean, it's a bit of both. I think if you know that it's based on true events, but some of the details being filled in, then I think it's fair for it to be sold as non-fiction with the fact that it's just been embellished a bit.
Yeah, exactly. They are trying to tell a true story, but not everybody has all the facts. So they can only tell as good as they can, as good as the facts can be. And they don't just want to pass on facts because oftentimes when you read a true crime book, you'll be really interested in it, you really enjoy it, but you won't you'll put it down and you probably will remember some of it. But being told in story form, you remember a lot more and you feel a lot more about it because it's being told from, say, the view of the victim, say the depravity that the murderer feels, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, if you would just imagine a situation where the story was telling you, oh, some shouting was heard from in this room, and then there was a gunshot 5 minutes later. That doesn't really build much. That might be the information the cops have, but actually, if you can see inside that and you have the whole things that led to the argument and everything like that, and you've got all this extra detail that may or may not be right. Maybe it's pieced together from other bits of information. Someone was quite flirtatious and perhaps they'd been cheating or something like that. And all of a sudden you throw in those details. Again, you're more gripped by the story. You've got this, what's going on in the room, even though no one truly knows what's going on in the room. You've got a better idea than, well, yeah, there was some shouting and some shooting.
Yeah. And now think of the way history is done.
Yeah. I mean, especially ancient history, we know a lot of it was definitely mythicized.
Yeah, it's piecing together the bits that we do have and trying to come up with a narrative that joins them all together to the best of our knowledge. And to some extent, that's kind of what Truman Capote was doing and the Happy Little Murderers book was doing.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things about history, is how, especially the further back you go, the less accurate it is. And there is sometimes, only one or two little bits of evidence about a particular person, and a whole narrative is created by them, because of what it said on their tombstone. It's like, I mean, anyone can write anything on a tombstone. That might not be true. They might have not been the leader of this army. They might not have done whatever. All you know is there's a tombstone there and you've just filled in a massive blank.
Yeah. And now think of also something like, have you ever seen Snow with Johnny Depp?
No.
Where he's the drug smuggler.
That was Blow, wasn't it?
Blow, that's it. Blow.
Yeah. I have, yeah.
Sorry. That's telling a true story using eyewitness testimony, using autobiographical information. It's not the true story. So is that fiction or is it nonfiction? Again, it's that nice blending of the two. Because if you read the book Blow, you probably wouldn't remember it half as well as you remember the film because of how good Johnny Depp was, or Penelope Cruz.
Yeah, that's fair.
And sometimes a dramatic retelling is just better.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, you could say the same thing with, like going to a theatre and watching a play versus, just sitting there reading the script. Same sort of difference, like having it actually performed for you can make certain things stick in your mind. One of the positive effects of story told through musical form as well. Musicals can be really effective if they've got a catchy tune. And I'm really sure that the person at the time didn't start singing in reality, but you've now got this tune in your head and it goes round, you're remembering something extra. So, catching up. Hi, Babylon. Nice to see you here. Classic example, there's a feedback between fiction and reality without endorsing anything else from Nickland. What identifies as hyperstition is potentially useful. I've not seen This Is Spinal Tap.
Stop the stream, go watch it. It's an amazing film. It goes all the way up to 11.
Really?
Well, he's got an amp.
Yeah,
he's written a number. Yeah.
Hello. We're apparently your two favourite Britons. I mean, it is a pretty low bar. It'd have to be with how short we are.
Hey, fucker, I'm tall.
When you lie down.
You do not watch my graduation. I towered above the people on the stage.
Yeah, but that's Welsh people. They're even smaller.
No, I was in Harrogate.
Oh, wait. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not driving all the way to Cardiff for a bloody graduation. Like 4 hours to Harrogate, 7 hours to Cardiff. I'm going to England.
That's insane, isn't it?
I'll blend in with the enemy.
The roads around there are so bad. It's insane that, like, it's a much shorter distance to Cardiff.
Yep. But Harrogate is like half the time.
Lone Wolf says a huge genre of books prior to the 20th century were adventure diaries of people who were going around the world trying to discover new things. They were big with naturalists. Think of Darwin. Okay, so it's just basically people doing that, and a lot of them were sort of like people trying to be like a real life Sherlock Holmes. Not Sherlock Holmes. Indiana Jones. Holmes Jones, but yeah. And he says, Verne, being a naturalist, got ever more frustrated with the habits of some authors who would, in some cases, just make up nonsense and publish it as if they had seen it on Safari. Fair. I can imagine that.
I'm kind of knackered, which means I can't remember this guy's name, but he wrote a tale about going to the moon, I think it was, and he published it as if it was a true story. But it was obviously all fictionalized, and it was a take on those actual kind of stories and narratives that were going on, where it was, I really did go on this adventure where I met 23 cannibals and got chased by giant boulders.
Well, I mean that might be the Verne one that Lone Wolf was talking about.
It could be, but I don't think it was Jules Verne. I think it was someone else. I think it might have been a German guy.
Ah, fair. I wouldn't know either way. Sorry. Crisis says, yeah, true. It's such a conundrum trying to have these conversations, sometimes, depending on the participants. I think most of the time. Especially if it's on somewhere, like Twitter or Facebook, and you're in a debate group, or you're just on Twitter, which is obviously a public debate constantly. People are always battle ready. People are always looking to defend a position, attack your position, belittle, and so on and so forth. So they're not looking for that same conversation. That's not everyone, and it's definitely not everyone. We've met some amazing people there, and some of them are here with us tonight. But you're more likely to have that sort of negative conversation in that arena. I think it's why I definitely get involved in conversation there less and less. Unless someone tags me into something or I'm posting a new article, I don't go looking for conversation there that much anymore, which is a shame, but it's also good because I'm definitely far too addicted to social media. Speaking of that, is Instagram a noble fiction? No.
Only when people use filters.
I mean, depends what they're trying to do. If they're doing it because they just look so bad that it's beneficial to everyone else, then maybe. But if they're doing it to sell you something, then surely it's not for the best, especially if the product they're selling you by using the filters is a bad one. Oh, yeah. Ben's got a good point there. Like stories about dinosaur behavior inferred from known examples or of related or modern animals, or even the sounds dinosaurs would make. Not even just their behaviors, the sound. We don't know what dinosaurs make. They could just sound like, that could have actually been the sound of a dinosaur, for all we know. Or they could have talked like this, they're just very stuck.
They could have just breathed bad breath on you as part of communication without making any sound. Yeah,
it's true. So yeah, no, you're right. Actually, a lot of what we know about dinosaurs is again just inferred fictions, and it's why sometimes the more we learn about the science behind what we know, and sort of we uncover more fossils, and we can, extrapolate a little bit more DNA and understand what that means. We can go, oh no, like these dinosaurs, these particular ones had feathers, or they were partially feathered, and it changes some of our ideas about them. But even then, we're still building a picture. So yeah, it's a scientific history, I guess. It's that blend of making shit up from incomplete information, but it's not making shit up to deceive people. It's piecing together incomplete pieces and applying our current knowledge and everything that's been learnt between to make sense of something.
Yeah, exactly. Another kind of more modern or an example that goes on now, kind of doing it with modern times. Think of a court case and a police investigation. They're taking these bits and they're creating a grander narrative, filling in the information. Are they doing it to deceive? Some might be. But most of the time they're creating this picture to try and tell a story of what happened using bits of information and then filling in the gaps. So would the people who call the Bible fiction call that fiction?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you actually think about prosecution and defense, a jury are more swayed by charisma than facts in themselves.
The better the storyteller, the more likely you are to win your case.
Yeah.
My Cousin Vinny's a good example. I know it sounds daft, but the way Joe Pesci is in that film, he looks like an idiot, but he comes across as the better lawyer because he's got that charisma and he's got that ability to tell the story. He's got that New Yorker Italian charm, and that helps him in his case.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. Lone Wolf is singing "The Hills Are Alive" with the sound of music. I can't hear that without having to go ah. But the sound of music, I suppose that is another fiction about real events that happened. In fact, I mean it's a fictionalized non-fiction, though, isn't it? Again, there was the Von Trapp family manor, and a lot of those things did actually happen. So that would
list.
Yeah, I mean, both of those, would we say, are on the non-fiction side with certain fictionalized points?
That's kind of the way I would see it. It's fictionalized non-fiction. They're attempting to tell you a true story, but just not everything in it is true.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Another one that was brought up earlier was Goodfellas.
Yeah.
Like, you think about the film, that's taken from Nicholas Pileggi's book. Martin Scorsese was attempting to tell you the true story of Henry Hill, but he was also attempting to give a morality tale. Look, if you think about The Godfather, The Godfather kind of glorifies this organized crime life and the mafia life by saying, you know, it's all about honor and companionship and doing what's best for your family. And then you have Goodfellas, which is like, these people are just a bunch of fucking psychopaths who will kill you over an argument. They'll kill you because they don't want to pay you the $50 they owe you. So he was attempting to tell a true story, but through that true story also impart a morality tale. So the true story is the vehicle for the morality tale. And Nicholas Pileggi's book is another attempt to just tell the truth of what went on, not actually impart a morality tale. But if you think about Henry Hill, he's an unreliable narrator. So can we get good nonfiction from an unreliable narrator?
No.
But you see, I mean, he'll obviously remember big events pretty well and all that kind of stuff. But he's also that kind of person where, you know, he's a gangster. He embellishes. He tells a good story.
Mm.
And he wants to kind of paint himself in a better picture because, you know, he's going to jail.
Yeah.
He's going to be given his testimony. He wants that plea deal. He wants the witness protection. So he's not going to tell it. He's not going to make himself look as bad as he actually was.
Yeah, true. He's got something in it. This is one of the things that I've come to talk to people about when we're talking about lies as well. You know, and believing people on just their testimony. If I was, for example, late for a stream or late to meet a friend, and I would say, "Oh yeah, you know, the bus was delayed," probably perfectly fine for you to believe me. And even if it happened regularly, you know, there's nothing that I'm going to lose by this. But if it was maybe my boss, why are you late again? Oh yeah, the bus was delayed, when actually I just overslept. The reason I'm telling him that is because if I tell him I've overslept, whereas I could just tell you I overslept. Sorry, dude.
There's nothing in it.
No. Yeah. Now it'd be crazy for me to say anything like this because I work from home, but I've also got flexible hours, so it's nothing that had actually come up. But there is a certain weighting that you can put on testimony. And the example you gave there is someone who had something they could benefit from their testimony, their information that they're giving. So that casts a bit of doubt on what they're saying. There's still probably a large portion of truth in there. But as you say, they would benefit from making themselves potentially seem not as bad as they were. And this is it. You can believe people on testimony. You've just got to weight it. If you go to someone, you're at work, and someone tells you their name, it's perfectly rational to believe that that's their name, right? Some guy trying to sell you something in the back corner, maybe it's a little bit more fishy. And Lone Wolf did confirm that was Jules Verne. That's the story he was talking about, From the Earth to the Moon. So there we go.
Yeah, my mistake. My apologies, Dave.
So that's useful. Carrying on, Kimo says, many of us believe we know what an avalanche or a tornado sound like because we've heard them in movies. That's another great one. In fact, even nature videos, they often put the sounds in
as
after
backing
the fact.
sound. Yeah.
And that's not actually what it sounded like at the time, or what those creatures sounded like, or the noises they were making. And obviously with that, they're at least still nature sounds for the most part. But as you say, like the avalanche and stuff like that is going to be dramatized. And that's in something like a nature program. And when you see it in a movie, it's definitely going to be overplayed. Crisis says, yeah, people really need to learn how to talk with each other. Online, definitely. I think most of the people you meet online that behave in the ways that we were talking about earlier wouldn't behave in those ways in person. Like most of them would probably shy away from any form of confrontation. There's that anonymity there that makes them feel protected and feel braver than they are. So, yeah, I think people need to try and treat online conversation as if they were actually sat down with these people and they were not trying to have a fight with them. They were trying to find truth with them.
Imagine the person you're speaking to is Jay and Silent Bob at the end of Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back, where they look at all the bad reviews and they go around and they beat up anybody who posted a bad review.
This is true. It says, people honestly believe they sound more like birds, especially because bird ancestors, they are bird ancestors and their voice boxes, but we still weren't there. Yeah, so that's going back to the dinosaurs. Yeah, there is a thought that they could actually have sounded more like birds than we actually hear. I think the sounds, I can't remember what it is, but the sounds of the roars within Jurassic Park is actually something like a blend of like 3 or 4 different animals and time stretched and all sorts, just to sound as horrific as it was. So again, yeah, we're all sort of inferring it from the information that we've got. It's amazing.
It is. Is it the T-Rex that we used to believe walked upright and then we found some bone and realized it didn't? It walked more like that than like that? There's some dinosaur where we assume they were upright, but they were actually more like that.
Yeah, I do remember it. And then there was also this one that happened when I was a kid. There was I don't know if it was the T-Rex either, but then I think this was actually a mistake made because bones were found together, but they thought that actually what they thought was the T-Rex style creature actually had 4 normal legs. The little hands weren't theirs after all. And then they found out that actually, no, that was wrong and they were right in the first place. And it's like, you know.
Yeah. So they were just trying to tell the story of what it looked like. So for the people who say a fiction is a falsehood, well, that was a falsehood, but was it a fiction?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Ben brings up Chopper Read. I've watched Chopper. Yeah, it was a good one, that was.
One of my ex-girlfriend's dad was in jail with him at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
My dad liked to tell a story about when he met the Krays. I've ever told you about this one?
No.
So, my dad was someone that would talk a lot of shit and talk to anyone, and you know, and he went in to one of their clubs in London or whatever, and he was sat at the bar, and I think it was Ronnie Kray was there, and I still don't know if this story is true, but I believe my dad when he told me, and he just started chatting to him and asking him about this and that and how's things going, and the Kray brother started getting a little bit shifty, and he sort of called someone over, and they all got up, and he was like, "Come with me," and he was like, "What?" And then they pulled him off, and they sort of went upstairs. And we went up this thing. He was like, "What's going on?" It's just, "We're going this way." I was like, okay. They went down this long corridor, and then turned into the door on the left, and he went into this bathroom, and he was like, "Oh fuck, what have I done? I'm gonna get killed." And the guy pointed to the sink and said, "Do that." And he went, "What?" I went, "Do that." And he looked at it, and there were 2 lines of Coke down on the sink. And he was like, "What, for me?" He's like, "Yeah." And got a note. The guy gave him a £20 note. He snorted it, handed it to him. He said, "Do the other one." He went, "Right." Snorted the other one. "Thank you very much." And that was what convinced him that he wasn't a police officer, because obviously he was trying to talk about the business too much.
Yeah. Yeah, you get paranoid when you're in that life.
Rev says, how many books are written with theories about who was D.B. Cooper? They can't all be correct, but they're certainly not fiction. That's another good point. That's where the line is, you know. You could also say
the intent of what it's trying to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The intent comes down to it. It's the same with lying and falsehoods and truth and fiction, non-fiction. The intent is a massive part of it. And, you know, you can say the same about morality as well. The intent is a big part of it. Kimo says, it's one of the first errors you're cautioned about in archaeology. Don't think, if I were a Neanderthal guy, what would I have used the pointy rock for? You're not a Neanderthal guy. That's a good point.
Yeah.
I suppose that's one of the hardest things, though. You've got to try and evolve yourself. Like, if I didn't have this thought process I currently have, and all of the knowledge that I've got up until now, how would I have reacted? Because, I mean, I know they're saying not to do that, but to do that effectively, you'd have to just strip away, 50 to 200,000 years worth of evolution as a species.
What's it like to be a Neanderthal? What's it like to be a bat? We can't know either.
No. No. I suppose you might have a slight inclination closer to a Neanderthal, but that's because they seem more similar. More similar? Similar? Words are going wrong. Hey, Luke. Why aren't you here?
He is here. He's right there.
Yeah, but he's not here.
If he's there, can he be here?
Yes.
Even though he's here, but there.
It's the internet. You can be anywhere and nowhere at the same time.
The internet makes us all God. We're sort of semi-omnipresent.
To an extent, yeah. More so than we would be. And I suppose you could say certain big tech firms almost do have that all-seeing eye. Especially with the fact that so many of us are all on social media and taking pictures and everything. Like, God, could you imagine the sort of profiles that we actually have on people these days? You know, with all the stuff, you know, like doing these streams, having these discussions, taking pictures of your kids, taking pictures of your holidays, all the phone calls that you have, fitness trackers, the music you listen to is now all on playlists on Spotify and stuff like that. The shops that you go to are all online. It's you know, your digital footprint must be absolutely massive, and someone to mine all that data, they could know so much about you. It's kind of scary, really. We're back to discussing 1984 by Orwell, aren't we? Completely sober, Luke. Been drinking the water, or space as it looks like. See? So no. This is.
I will have a big bag of weed by the end of June, though.
Nice.
Because it's my birthday. So, yeah, I've booked in some weed to be brought to me.
Awesome. So, was there anything else that you think that we should cover off on this topic tonight?
I mean, there's other stuff we could discuss, I guess, if you wanted. Like, what does it mean for something to have truth in fiction? We've already sort of covered that off, though. It sort of gives us metaphorical truth, teaches us moral lessons, teaches us social lessons. So, yeah, there's that kind of stuff. I was mostly interested tonight to just go over the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, because that's something I see a lot in the atheist community. Well, that's just fiction. Well, what do you mean by just fiction? You know?
Most definitely. Did you on Thursday want to have a go at doing the philosophy games stream that we were talking about last week?
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we were thinking about next week having a go at the philosophy games, but we were thinking of maybe opening it up as a free-for-all as well. So we're not going to post the link beforehand, but when the stream is live, we'll drop a link to it so people can join us in the chat if they so wish. And we're going to be playing some philosophy games from a website, and you know, just coming up with, or you know, all the different answers that we all have together, and just discussing the things that we do. It's a bit of a different take on things for us. We've done a couple like this before, where we did those morality questions, and we went through, and then we'd sort of go, well, this is my gut instinct for this question, but then we'd discuss it. Sometimes it would change our minds, sometimes it wouldn't. And then we got our results at the end of it, and it was a good laugh. But there's going to be a few more of those. So I don't know how long Thursday's stream will go for and how many games that we go through, but 9 p.m. GMT is when it will definitely kick off. I am going to be at a barbecue beforehand, so I might be unable to do the pre-stream mix, so I'll pencil the breakbeat mix in for Ben next Tuesday, and I'll have to dig out all my breakbeat tracks and try and organize them a little bit. Maybe mix it with a bit of electro house at the same time. But yeah, awesome. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss before we go today, Dave?
Nope, that was pretty good. I published an article the other day for the first time in like a year, just in case anybody wants to go read it, discussing why the discussion of atheism can be an important topic, not to find out whether there's one true definition of atheism, but because of the bad skepticism and bad epistemology and that kind of stuff that goes on in these discussions. And I got another one coming out in the next couple of days, hopefully, where it's the response to that Daniel Goldman guy who talks about belief.
Awesome.
And says that he couldn't find a definition in psychology.
Yeah, I remember that. That was amusing, shall we say. Let's leave it at that. I've posted the link to your article about that. So yeah, as Dave mentions, he's not talking about like the definition of atheism. It's not an article about that sort of thing. Although it's quite amusing, the responses that we got. In fact, the off of Jeff was some of the weirdest ones.
Yeah.
Because someone comes in. So Jeff posted, and thank you for that, Jeff. Most appreciated. Whenever anyone shares our articles or gives us a shout out, we absolutely love it. Really appreciate it. But he shared it out, and the person's first response was something like, Steve McRae
was completely wrong on his stream the other night.
Yeah. It's like, well, and that he was a narcissist and this and that, and it was just like, well, what's that got to do with the article? And it was like, this person went on chatting for about an hour, and we kept on talking about how this article has nothing to do with this. Like, this, and then they eventually open the article. We say, you've spent an hour, like, not reading an article that would take you 5 minutes to read. They eventually open it, and they don't even read it. They skim and find a couple of images. And it's like, right, okay, yeah, that's brilliant. That's not really giving you any information about what is in the article. The images are largely being used as quotes of some people say this, some people say that. This is what, they're referring to certain bits of dogma, rather than actually saying that this is the case. So yes, there is that. I also released an article today called "Forming a Hypothesis," and I may even get round to either doing that as a sci-fi short or an article reading. I haven't decided which. So I need time to do that, obviously. And I've got a second part to that as well, called the null hypothesis. Well, the working title, and probably the title that it's going to be, because I'm terrible at naming things, is the null hypothesis and misunderstanding the null hypothesis and knowledge. And it's talking about common misconceptions that people have with science, including us atheists who seem to love science, and going through, depending on the definition of atheism, could it be considered the null hypothesis, and breaking down a statement Matt made the other day, as in Matt Dillahunty, about the null hypothesis as well. And then it goes into talking about a statement Matt also made about agnosticism. And so I talk about different types of knowledge within this. So it's mostly science, a little bit of philosophy. Yeah. As Luke says, it's painful at the moment. People are getting so much wrong. I mean, you're right. I mean, even in a conversation I was having, now I had a really positive conversation with Anti-Citizen X, in the sense that it was a good conversation. It didn't turn into a poo flinging thing. So the pair of us, even though we didn't necessarily agree with each other, it was a case of, it was a good conversation, and I carried it on under his video that he linked me to on YouTube. And again, we had a positive conversation there. I don't know if I convinced him that his use of the null hypothesis isn't what it is used as in science. He had an idea that, you know, the null hypothesis is not believing something, basically. That's your default position. He had a few sort of ideas about that. But I can understand where he's coming from. But he was like, well, what would you call it? I'd say, well, it's sort of like either skepticism or cynicism, depending on how you're using it. It sounds like you're leaning, and with other statements, it sounds like you're leaning to a form of evidentialism, you know, which is all fine, but none of that makes it the null hypothesis. And your attitude can't be the hypothesis. You know, that you. It might be that I believe this hypothesis, but your attitude can't be a hypothesis. Anyway, I'm going to give too much of my articles away over the next couple of days, so I'm not going to do it. And next Monday, you've got to remember, is our fortnightly Psyched episode with Bearded Heretic. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I know I can't always join them when they first start, but once I've got the kids in bed, I can join the chat and annoy Luke, which is always a good laugh. Kimmo says, Mr. Dillahunty's platform is too large for him to keep fucking things up this bad. You'd think so. But unfortunately, as Dave's article points out, it's, well, I tell you what, go read his article. I'm not going to go into it. He basically backs up this point and explains it. So, yeah. Awesome. Well, in that case, I'm going to just say thank you, everybody who has joined us here tonight. I've had a really good show. Been fun interacting with all of you, and obviously you as well, Dave. It's always good. And I'm looking forward to Thursday, where we play some games together. Other than that, Dave, can you think of any videos recently that are worth recommending?
Ooh, I'm not sure. Godless Granny did one the other day that I saw, having a better conversation, where she gives a critique of Cameron Bertuzzi. That was pretty good. Awesome. And David Wellman's Ask an Atheist was pretty good.
2 great videos worth checking out. All right.